It was a kind of wilderness where silence takes on a weight of its own. In the high reaches of Colorado's Indian Peaks wilderness, near a place called Thunderbolt Creek, a family from Santa Fe had set out on a simple backpacking trip. It was August 2014, the height of summer in the Rockies. Clear skies stretched overhead, and the sound of rushing meltwater carved its way down steep ravines. The family had expected nothing more than a challenging hike, a chance to disconnect from the modern world. But that afternoon, one of them stopped suddenly. There, half buried among loose rock and damp soil, lay something pale, something that looked unsettlingly out of place against the dark forest floor. At first, it seemed like the bleached curve of a branch. Yet as they drew closer, realization tightened their throats. This was no wood. It was bone. The family froze. The remoteness of the area made the discovery more disturbing. This wasn't the sort of place where people casually wandered, and as they scanned the ground around them, it became clear this wasn't just a stray bone left behind by wildlife. It bore the unmistakable size and shape of a human limb. There was no cell signal in the remote valley, no way to alert authorities immediately. The family had to make a decision: keep the discovery to themselves or try to get the word out. They chose the latter. In a hastily scribbled note, they described what they had found, handing it to passing hikers who promised to deliver it down the trail. The note eventually made its way to U.S. Forest Service officials and then to law enforcement. Within days, search teams returned to the site. What they uncovered confirmed the family's worst suspicions: scattered skeletal remains, fragments of clothing, a backpack, and, tucked inside, identification. The remains, investigators believe, belonged to a woman who had been missing for more than 2 years. Her name was Patricia Wallace. For over 2 years, Patricia's story had hung in a cruel limbo. She was 72 years old when she vanished during a summer hike on July 3rd, 2012. At first, her disappearance drew massive search efforts, with rescue crews K-9 teams and volunteers combing the rugged terrain of the Buchanan Pass Trail in both Boulder and Grand counties. But after 13 days of fruitless searching, no sign of Patricia was found. Not a piece of gear, not a footprint, not even a clue suggesting which direction she had gone. Her daughter, Katie Moore, described the aftermath as being trapped in a living nightmare. For 2 years, she lived with the impossible balance of hope and grief, never sure if her mother was alive, never able to fully mourn. And now, in August 2014, that nightmare shifted into something else entirely. Closure had finally arrived, but in the cruelest possible way. Her mother's remains scattered in a remote drainage, moved and broken apart by avalanches and runoff. The recovery effort at Thunderbolt Creek was delicate. Teams collected what they could: skeletal fragments, personal belongings, and Patricia's backpack. The backpack, in particular, was telling. It contained her identification, confirming to investigators that this was not a case of mistaken identity. It was Patricia, but while the discovery solved the question of where, it left the haunting mystery of how. How had Patricia, an experienced hiker with friends by her side, ended up alone in such a perilous spot? How had she traveled so far off from where searchers had expected her to be? And why, despite the massive search effort in 2012, had nothing at all been found until now? Authorities pointed to the brutal geography of the Indian Peaks wilderness. This is not a forgiving landscape. Sheer ridges, loose rock slides, avalanche chutes, and thick underbrush conceal everything. A single misstep can lead to disorientation. Once lost, the terrain can swallow a person whole. Add in unpredictable weather and the altitude, over 10,000 feet in places, and survival becomes even more unlikely. Over the following weeks, officials pieced together a likely scenario. Patricia had become separated from her hiking group, believing she was taking an easier route. She may have wandered deeper into the backcountry than intended, eventually succumbing to the elements. Her remains were then gradually carried by natural forces: snowmelt, avalanches, spring runoff, until they came to rest in the drainage where the family stumbled across them. For Patricia's daughter, the news was both devastating and strangely relieving. She spoke of the torment of those 2 years of silence, the inability to answer when people asked, "Do you know what happened?" With the discovery, she finally had an answer. Her mother's story was no longer suspended between hope and despair. It had a conclusion, however tragic. Investigators called the discovery nothing short of miraculous. In a wilderness where thousands of acres can conceal secrets indefinitely, finding Patricia at all was against the odds. And yet, it had happened by pure chance, an unsuspecting family taking a summer hike, stopping at the right place at the right time. The story of Patricia Wallace begins here, not in 2012, but in 2014, with a haunting image of bone on a forest floor and the ripple of shock that followed. It is a story of wilderness and risk, of the limits of human endurance, and of a daughter's long wait for answers. But to understand how Patricia ended up in that remote drainage, to grasp the choices, conditions, and circumstances that led to her disappearance, we must go back to July 2012, when a grandmother laced up her boots for what she thought would be an invigorating summer hike, and instead walked into a mystery that would outlast her own life. July 3rd, 2012, dawned like any other midsummer morning in the Colorado Rockies. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. High above, Buchanan Pass cut its rugged line through the Indian Peaks wilderness, a stretch of mountains that attracts thousands of hikers every season. On that morning, among the hikers preparing for the day's trek, was 72-year-old Patricia Wallace. Patricia was not new to the outdoors. Friends and family described her as adventurous, a woman who loved the mountains. Though older, she still carried the vitality of someone who refused to let age confine her to the sidelines. For her, hiking was not just recreation, it was connection, to nature, to her friends, to herself. That morning, she set out with companions for a day on the Buchanan Pass Trail, a route known for both its beauty and its challenges. The trail begins at Camp Dick, a rustic campground nestled in Boulder County. From there, it winds into thick lodgepole forest before climbing toward alpine tundra and rocky ridges. At elevations over 10,000 feet, the air thins, and every step requires effort. Hikers face steep switchbacks, unpredictable weather, and a disorienting scale of endless forest and stone. Patricia and her companions started together, chatting as they made their way along the trail. But at some point during the hike, a decision was made that would alter the course of everything. According to investigators, Patricia believed she had found an easier route. Perhaps the switchbacks seemed too demanding. Perhaps she wanted to pace herself differently. Whatever the reason, she broke from the group, intending to rejoin them later. It was a small choice, one that any hiker might make on any ordinary day. But in the wilderness, small choices often carry outsized consequences. The group continued on, unaware of the gravity of the separation. At first, there was no reason to worry. Patricia was experienced, and the trail, though rugged, was well established. They may have assumed she would appear ahead of them, or circle back if she grew tired. But as the hours passed and Patricia did not return, unease crept in. When she failed to meet back up, concern turned into alarm. Efforts to find her on the trail quickly proved futile. The wilderness, vast and unyielding, had swallowed her whole. By that evening, local authorities were alerted. Search and rescue teams mobilized, beginning what would become one of the most exhaustive hunts in the region's history. For Patricia's daughter, Katie Moore, the news hit like a thunderclap. One moment, her mother had been enjoying a hike. The next, she was missing without a trace. Katie described the days that followed as a blurred dread, waiting for updates, clinging to hope. She knew her mother was resilient. She had survived hardships in her life. But the wilderness was indifferent to human willpower, and every hour that passed without news deepened the fear. Back in the mountains, searchers deployed ground teams, helicopters, and K-9 units. They combed over 17 miles of terrain, retracing steps along the Buchanan Pass Trail, and venturing into adjacent drainages. They searched for footprints, clothing, dropped equipment, any sign that Patricia had moved through the area. But the mountains offered nothing. No trail, no clues, no answers. The conditions were brutal. July storms rolled across the high ridges, unleashing sudden bursts of rain and lightning. Dense forests obscured lines of sight. Avalanches and rock slides scarred the landscape, complicating access. Even the dogs struggled, their noses confused by the sheer spread of scents and the thin air. After days turned into a week, frustration set in. How could a woman vanish so completely in an area so thoroughly searched? Search leaders noted the disturbing lack of evidence. Normally, even when a missing person is not found quickly, searchers recover items, a piece of gear, torn clothing, some clue. In Patricia's case, nothing surfaced. It was as though she had stepped off the trail and into a void. By the 13th day, reality began to harden. Resources were stretched thin. Volunteers were exhausted. The official search was suspended. For Katie Moore, the decision felt like abandonment, but she understood the scale of what crews were facing. The wilderness had yielded no answers, and hope, at least for rescuers, had grown faint. For the family, however, hope lingered. Katie could not bring herself to fully accept that her mother was gone. She continued to describe Patricia not as lost, but as missing, an important distinction for someone trapped between grief and denial. Without proof, without remains, there was always a chance, however slim, that Patricia might still be alive, somewhere. In those early weeks after the search ended, the wilderness grew quiet again. Hikers came and went. Seasons changed. Snow blanketed the ridges, then melted away. Patricia's story slipped from the headlines. Yet for her family, silence was a cruelest wound. Every day without answers kept the pain alive. 2 years would pass before the mountains revealed their secret. And when they did, the discovery would be as jarring as it was final. A bone in the dirt, stumbled upon by strangers, delivering the closure that 2 years of searching had failed to bring. But before we return to that discovery, the question remains, what happened in those crucial hours after Patricia stepped away from her group? Why did she vanish so completely? And why, despite a search spanning miles of wilderness, was there not a single trace until 2014? The investigation into those questions forms the heart of Patricia Wallace's story, a story of terrain, time, and the unfathomable risks hidden in the quiet beauty of the Rockies. The moment Patricia Wallace was reported missing on July 3rd, 2012, the machinery of wilderness rescue roared to life. In Boulder and Grand counties, missing hikers were not unusual, but the case of a 72-year-old woman alone in the Indian Peaks wilderness carried urgency. Every hour mattered. Search and rescue teams converged on the Buchanan Pass Trail. They came armed with maps, GPS devices, radios, and the experience of countless prior missions. Trained dogs were deployed, noses pressed to the ground, straining to catch a scent in the thin mountain air. Helicopters scanned from above, their rotors chopping the silence, hoping to spot a brightly colored jacket or the reflective gleam of gear. On the ground, dozens of volunteers, rangers, and deputies fanned out in coordinated grids. They walked trails and bushwhacked through undergrowth, calling Patricia's name again and again into the silence. The forest gave no reply. The terrain was their first and greatest adversary. The Indian Peaks wilderness is both stunning and unforgiving. Elevations climb past 11,000 feet. Trails vanish into rocky outcroppings and avalanche chutes. Drainages drop steeply into valleys where water rushes unchecked, concealing hazards beneath its surface. Searchers noted how easily a hiker could lose their bearings. One wrong turn at a junction, one slip into a drainage, and the trail behind disappears. For someone Patricia's age, fatigue could compound disorientation. A route that seemed easier might have quickly turned into something far more treacherous. Yet despite the dangers, rescuers expected to find something. A footprint in mud, a broken branch, a water bottle. But as the days dragged on, their efforts turned up nothing at all. On day 3, frustration mounted. Normally, the first 72 hours are when missing hikers are found, alive or otherwise. That window slipped past. On day 5, the search expanded to cover more than 17 miles of trail and backcountry terrain. Helicopters dipped lower, scrutinizing ridges and valleys. 9 teams retraced routes again and again. Still nothing. By day 8, hope began to fray. Searchers confided their disbelief. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a person to vanish without leaving a single trace. Wildlife attacks, falls, hypothermia. These scenarios usually left signs. Here, The wilderness was mute. For Katie Moore, Patricia's daughter, the updates were unbearable. Each phone call carried the weight of expectation. Maybe they found her. Maybe today is the day. But every update was the same, negative. Katie described herself as being caught between dread and denial. She believed in her mother's resilience, but the absence of evidence gnawed at her. Authorities explored every possibility. Had Patricia intentionally wandered off? Was this a case of disorientation linked to early dementia, as some speculated? Or had she simply miscalculated, believing her shortcut would reconnect with the main trail? None of the theories offered comfort. What made the case so haunting was its lack of a narrative. Rescuers had no markers, no clues to build a sequence of events. Patricia had not simply disappeared. She had been erased. After nearly 2 weeks, resources dwindled. Volunteers, exhausted and battered by storms and rough terrain, were rotated out. Helicopters returned to their bases. On day 13, officials made the painful decision to suspend the active search. It was a decision no one took lightly. To the rescuers, ending a search always left a residue of guilt, the sense that someone was still out there waiting to be found. For Katie, it was devastating. It meant that the mountain had won, at least for now. But even as the official search ended, the family's vigil did not. Katie clung to the belief that one day, answers would come. The question was when and how. The months turned into years. The wilderness cycled through its seasons. Snow buried the ridges, then melted into torrents that carved new paths through stone. Trees fell, underbrush thickened. Nature covered over the human story it had swallowed. Patricia's case became another cold entry in missing persons databases. Her photo appeared on websites like the Charlie Project. To strangers, she was just another face among thousands of the disappeared. To Katie, she was her mother, suspended in uncertainty. In wilderness cases, closure often never arrives. Many remain missing indefinitely, their fates sealed under snow, rock, or forest. That seemed to be Patricia's destiny, until August 2014, when the mountain finally gave something back. 2 years after the last radio call was made, a family hiking near Thunderbolt Creek stumbled on a bone. And with that, the silence was broken. The discovery would prove both miraculous and haunting. But to understand why Patricia's remains lay there, scattered and concealed, investigators would need to piece together the forces of nature that rule the Rockies. Avalanches, runoff, and time itself had played a role in her final resting place. And yet, the question lingered. Why had the 2012 search, one of the most comprehensive in the region, miss her entirely? When the official search for Patricia Wallace was suspended in July 2012, the mountains closed in around her story. Search teams packed their gear, the helicopters left the ridges, and the trails returned to their quiet rhythm of wind, water, and the occasional hiker's boot. To the public, it seemed as though the case had simply dissolved into the silence of the Rockies. But for Katie Moore, Patricia's daughter, the silence was unbearable. Every day was a new negotiation with grief. Without a body, without answers, there could be no closure. People asked her questions that she couldn't bring herself to answer. Is your mother alive? Do you think she just got lost? Do you believe she's gone? Katie would hesitate, searching for words that didn't exist. In interviews, she later explained the difficulty of even describing her mother's status. Missing was not the same as dead. Missing left a sliver of hope. Missing kept her mother suspended in a limbo where anything might still be possible. But missing also meant torture, the gnawing uncertainty that stretched on month after month, season after season. Meanwhile, the Indian Peaks wilderness reclaimed its secrets. Heavy snows buried the ridges in the winter of 2012 to 2013. Avalanches thundered down chutes, sweeping rocks and timber into valleys. In spring, meltwater roared through drainages, carrying debris and perhaps human remains. Downstream, by summer, the forest had grown dense again, brush concealing the ground, erasing the tracks of searchers and the faint traces of Patricia's passing. The following winter repeated the cycle, compounding the wilderness's hold over the truth. For 2 years, Patricia lay undiscovered in a remote drainage, her remains scattered by the natural violence of the landscape. For Katie, those 2 years were a study in endurance. Every holiday, Every birthday, every reminder of her mother carried with it a fresh sting. On some days, she let herself believe Patricia had survived somehow, perhaps disoriented but alive, sheltered by some unlikely miracle. On others, she faced a far harsher possibility, that her mother had died alone, frightened and cold, somewhere beyond the reach of human help. Friends and acquaintances tried to comfort her, but words rarely touched the reality of her situation. What she lived with was not grief in the traditional sense. It was something colder, something more corrosive, ambiguity. As time passed, Patricia's case slipped from headlines. New disappearances replaced hers in the public eye. The Charlie Project, a database of the missing, recorded her name, photo, and date of disappearance. There, among thousands of others, she became another statistic in a grim catalog of unresolved human vanishings. But Katie never let her mother's memory fade. She spoke of Patricia's love of the outdoors, her adventurous spirit, her resilience. For Katie, keeping her story alive was both an act of resistance against forgetting and a form of hope. Hope that one day the wilderness would surrender its secret. Then came August 2014. By sheer chance, in a stretch of remote terrain near Thunderbolt Creek, a family from Santa Fe stumbled across a pale fragment half buried in the dirt. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a branch, but the unmistakable curve of bone told a different story. The family knew they were far from cell service. They scribbled a note, pressed it into the hands of passing hikers, and sent it down the trail. That note would eventually make its way to the U.S. Forest Service, then to local law enforcement. The silence of 2 years had been broken. Search teams returned to the wilderness, retracing paths long since abandoned. They located the site described in the family's note. There, in the shadow of the creek, they recovered not just a bone but scattered skeletal remains, fragment of clothing, and a backpack containing identification. The name on the ID left no doubt. Patricia Wallace had finally been found. For Katie, the call came like a collision. She had imagined this moment countless times, yet nothing prepared her for the reality. Relief and devastation surged in equal measure. After 2 years of agonizing uncertainty, she finally had an answer. Her mother's fate was no longer a question mark. But knowing did not erase the pain. It deepened it. Patricia had not walked away. She had not been rescued. She had not returned. The mountains had kept her, and only time and chance had revealed her remains. Investigators concluded that Patricia had likely died not far from where she was eventually found. Her remains later carried by avalanches and run off into the drainage. It was a reminder how wilderness conceals and transforms, how even a massive search effort can be defeated by geography and weather. The discovery was called nothing short of miraculous. In such a vast and unforgiving landscape, the odds of stumbling upon remains were infinitesimal. And yet, by coincidence, by chance, the silence had finally given way. For Katie, the moment was both an ending and a beginning. The ending of hope, the beginning of mourning. She could finally speak of her mother not as missing, but as gone. Yet even with that closure, questions lingered. Questions about those final hours in 2012, about how and why Patricia had ended up in such a perilous place, and about what exactly had happened between her separation from her group and her final breath. These questions would never be fully answered, but the story of Patricia Wallace, sealed in silence for 2 years, had at last been unearthed, and with it came the sobering truth. In the wilderness, even the smallest decisions can carry fatal consequences. It was a summer afternoon in August 2014 when the quiet hum of the mountains was broken by chance. A family from Santa Fe, New Mexico, out for a day hike in the Indian Peaks wilderness, followed a remote stretch near Thunderbolt Creek. The trail was not well marked. Roots and rocks snagged boots, the underbrush pressing close. It was the kind of place where people rarely lingered. That was when one of them noticed something pale jutting out from the dirt. At first, it looked like driftwood, weathered and bleached by the elements. But the shape was wrong. Curved, smooth, hollowed in a way no branch would ever be. They crouched down. The realization was immediate, chilling. It was bone. For a moment, no one spoke. The wilderness that had seemed serene only minutes earlier now felt heavy, almost suffocating. A simple family hike had shifted into something darker, something irreversible. The family knew they had stumbled across something human, but they were miles from self-service. They improvised. Pulling out a scrap of paper, they scrawled a note. Found what appears to be human remains near Thunderbolt Creek. They folded it, pressed it into the hands of passing hikers, and asked them to deliver it once they reached civilization. Hours later, that note reached U.S. Forest Service officials. Soon after, it made its way to the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. Patricia Wallace's case, 2 years dormant, suddenly had a heartbeat again. Search teams returned to the mountains within days. They carried GPS units, evidence bags, and the weary knowledge that what they were about to recover was not the person so many had once searched for alive. The remains were scattered across a drainage. Investigators found skeletal fragments, shreds of clothing, and a backpack wedged among rocks and debris. The pack still contained identification. Patricia's name written in black ink, weathered but intact. The wilderness had held her secret for 2 long years, and now, piece by piece, it was releasing it. The news reached Katie Moore, Patricia's daughter, with the force of a tidal wave. She had lived through 2 years of torment, trapped in uncertainty. She had balanced between hope and despair, between believing her mother might somehow have survived and fearing she had perished in the mountains. Now, she had her answer. Patricia was gone. In later interviews, Katie described the discovery as a paradox. The relief of finally knowing, colliding with the grief of confirmation. It was what we were waiting for, she said. But it was also the moment that ended any possibility of her coming back. For investigators, the recovery site told a fragmented story. The placement of the remains suggested they had been moved over time, likely by avalanches in the winters of 2012 and 2013. Snow slides had carried the bones downhill, scattering them through the drainage. Spring runoff may have added to the dispersal. The wilderness had not just concealed Patricia, it had actively shifted her remains, rewriting the geography of her final moments. This explained why such an extensive search in 2012 had failed to locate her. She was no longer where she had first fallen. The family from Santa Fe who made the discovery later reflected on the eerie weight of their encounter. To hike into the forest expecting only beauty and to leave with the knowledge of death was something that lingered. Their chance find had changed the trajectory of Patricia's story and given her daughter the answer she had fought for through 2 years of silence. When news of Patricia's recovery spread, it reached the broader hiking community as well. Many remember the original searches in 2012, the helicopters over the ridges, the rescue teams combing through the brush. Now, with the discovery, there was a sense of closure, but also of caution. Her case became another grim reminder of how quickly the wilderness can turn fatal, and how easily even the most seasoned hikers can vanish in its vastness. For Katie, however, closure was complicated. It brought her back to the beginning, back to the unanswered question that had haunted her since the day her mother went missing. What happened in those final hours? Did Patricia take a wrong turn? Did she collapse from exhaustion? Did she try to backtrack and lose her bearings? Or was it something more sudden, an accident that gave her no chance to recover? The discovery provided proof of death, but not the story of how it came to be. By September 2014, Patricia Wallace's case was officially closed. Her remains had been positively identified through dental records. Investigators ruled out foul play. The cause of death was listed as environmental exposure, but beyond that, the details remained a mystery. For her daughter, the discovery marked the end of one chapter and the start of another, living with the truth, yet still without the full story. In the end, the wilderness had taken Patricia, hidden her, and only by coincidence, through the curiosity of family in the right place at the right time, was she returned. The silence of 2 years had broken, but the questions it left behind still echoed in the mountains. When Patricia Wallace's remains were recovered in 2014, law enforcement and wilderness investigators faced a question that could never be answered in full. What exactly happened to her in those final hours of July 2012? The discovery provided evidence of her death, but not a complete story. There were no signs of trauma, no indication of foul play. Her gear and backpack remained with her, suggesting she had not been the victim of theft or violence. What remained was a puzzle pieced together through terrain, weather, and probabilities. The most widely considered explanation was that Patricia had simply lost her way. The Indian Peaks wilderness is notorious for subtle, almost invisible trail forks. Some paths are official, others are game trails carved by elk or deer. Even for experienced hikers, a momentary lapse in attention can lead to the wrong direction. Patricia had been hiking with a group from her church when she first separated. The trails in that region weave between ridges and valleys, with switchbacks that look almost identical. Investigators speculated that she may have attempted to follow a path that seemed familiar, only to realize too late it led deeper into rough, unmarked country. Losing elevation in an attempt to find water or shelter could have pushed her toward the drainage where her remains were later found. If this theory is true, Patricia's final hours were likely spent in a slow, dawning realization that she had strayed far beyond where rescuers would expect to look. Another possibility was a medical collapse. At 74 years old, Patricia was healthy and active. She had hiked before, and friends describe her as tough and resilient. But age does not erase vulnerability. Altitude in the Indian Peaks wilderness reaches well over 10,000 feet, and the air grows thin. Even seasoned hikers sometimes suffer dizziness, confusion, or sudden drops in blood pressure. If Patricia experienced cardiac distress or a stroke, she could have become disoriented or incapacitated quickly. In such a scenario, the separation from her group might have been more dangerous than anyone initially realized. Investigators noted that without witnesses, there was no way to prove this theory. Still, medical emergency remained a hauntingly plausible explanation, one in which Patricia had little chance to summon help. The official conclusion leaned most heavily on environmental exposure. July in the Rockies can be deceptive. While afternoons may glow with warmth, nights often plunge toward freezing. Hypothermia can set in within hours, especially if a hiker is fatigued, dehydrated, or damp from sweat. If Patricia became disoriented and continued walking into the evening, the likelihood of exhaustion would have grown. Her body's reserves would have drained quickly. A missed turn, followed by hours of wandering, could have left her stranded without the strength to retrace her steps. By the time searchers scoured the area days later, storms had already swept across the ridges. The weather in those first 48 hours was a decisive factor. Exposure, investigators agreed, was almost certainly the cause of death. The avalanche factor. There was also the question of why she wasn't found sooner. In 2012, hundreds of searchers combed the region with dogs, helicopters, and infrared scans. And yet, no trace. The 2014 recovery site offered a clue: avalanche chutes. Patricia's remains were located in a drainage where snow slides often thunder through in winter. Investigators concluded that her body may have originally been higher on the slope, but repeated avalanches in the winters of 2012 and 2013 carried her downhill, scattering her bones. This explained why the original search failed. Patricia had been hidden not just by terrain, but by the violent rearranging of nature itself. What remains unknown. Despite these theories, the case left haunting uncertainties. Did she realize she was lost? Did she try to turn back toward her group? Were her last moments spent walking, calling out, or sitting down in resignation? For her daughter, Katie Moore, these were the questions that gnawed at the edges of closure. Knowing Patricia had died was one thing. Knowing how she faced those final hours was something entirely different. The wilderness offers no witnesses. It records no testimony, no last words. What it does preserve are fragments, gear, bones, clues scattered by weather and time. From those fragments, investigators built the most likely story. A seasoned but vulnerable hiker, separated from her group, lost to exhaustion and exposure, hidden by avalanches until chance revealed her again. And yet, even the best theories could not erase the silence surrounding her final hours. The Indian Peaks wilderness held its answers tightly, and some of them would never be known. When the phone rang in late August 2014, Katie Moore knew it wasn't just another update. For 2 years, she had lived with silence, with the slow suffocation of unanswered questions. And now, finally, there was an answer. But answers, she quickly learned, were not the same as peace. Authorities confirmed what the family from Santa Fe had stumbled upon. The remains were her mother's. Identification cards tucked in a weathered backpack, fragments of clothing, and dental records left no room for doubt. After 2 years of waiting, Patricia Wallace was no longer missing. She was gone. In interviews, Katie later described the moment as a collision of relief and devastation. For 2 years, she had been suspended between hope and despair, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward. Every time she tried to picture her mother, she saw 2 versions. One who might still be alive, wandering or sheltered somewhere unknown, and one who had perished in the Rockies. Now, with the discovery, the split collapsed into a single truth. The closure is there, Katie admitted, but it's not the kind you want. Relief arrived hand in hand with finality. The hope she had clung to, even in its most fragile form, was gone. What remained was grief, sharpened by certainty. In the weeks that followed, Katie spoke often about her mother. She described Patricia as independent, spirited, and deeply connected to the outdoors. Hiking was not a novelty for her. It was a joy, a part of her identity. That she vanished doing something she loved was both painful and strangely fitting. Patricia had been more than a missing person in a database. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who refused to let age keep her from adventure. Friends recalled her warmth, her resilience, and her ability to inspire others with her determination. For Katie, keeping those memories alive was vital. The discovery may have ended the uncertainty, but it did not erase who her mother had been. Speaking of Patricia became a way to reclaim her from the wilderness of silence. News of Patricia's recovery rippled through the hiking community and beyond. Many remember the headlines in 2012 when the elderly woman vanished without a trace. Some had followed updates as search teams scoured the mountains. Now, 2 years later, the outcome was sobering. Hikers online and in local papers reflected on the risks of the wilderness. Some saw Patricia's story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hiking alone or separating from a group. Others focused on a random cruelty of nature, how avalanches and storms had hidden her for so long, thwarting even the most exhaustive searches. But for Katie, the coverage was bittersweet. It reminded her that her mother's disappearance had been public in a way few deaths are. Strangers debated her fate, speculated about her choices, and used her as a symbol. Yet for Katie, this wasn't parable. It was personal. In private moments, Katie wrestled with the contradictions of closure. She no longer had to wait for news, no longer had to brace herself for every phone call. But now that the waiting was over, what remained was emptiness. She spoke openly about the strange cruelty of ambiguous loss, that space where grief cannot take its proper shape. For 2 years, she had lived there. Now, with her mother's remains recovered, the grief shifted into something recognizable, but no less painful. It's final now, she reflected, and final is hard. Yet she also expressed gratitude. Gratitude that the family in Santa Fe had chosen to speak up. Gratitude that, against the odds, her mother had been found at all. In such a vast wilderness, remains often go undiscovered forever. Patricia's story, however tragic, had at least found its resolution. Still, answers were incomplete. Investigators listed environmental exposure as a likely cause of death, but the details of Patricia's last hours remained hidden. Did she realize she was lost? Did she call out for her group? Did she keep walking until exhaustion forced her to stop? Or did she sit down quietly, aware of what was coming? Katie would never know. The wilderness had silenced her mother's story, leaving behind only fragments. And yet, Katie found meaning in keeping the conversation alive. By speaking about her mother, by remembering her as more than a case file, she refused to let Patricia's life be reduced to a mystery or a statistic. Patricia's case became a reminder that behind every missing person headline is a family living through the unimaginable. To outsiders, she was the elderly hiker who vanished. To Katie, she was the most important person in the world. And so, the aftermath of discovery was not simply about closure. It was about carrying forward memory, about holding space for grief, and about finding ways to live in the shadow of an answer that resolved the mystery, but not the heartache. For Katie, the wilderness would never again be just a place of beauty. It would forever be bound to the silence that swallowed her mother. But with Patricia's discovery, at least one truth had emerged from that silence. She was found, she was named, and she would not be forgotten. Patricia Wallace's disappearance and recovery were tragic, but they were not isolated. The Rocky Mountains, spanning from New Mexico to Canada, are a place of staggering beauty, but also staggering danger. Her case fits into a larger, unsettling pattern of hikers, climbers, and travelers who enter the wilderness and never return. For investigators, journalists, and families of the missing, the Indian Peaks wilderness and surrounding ranges have become symbolic of a grim reality. In the Rockies, people vanish with disturbing frequency, and not all of them are ever found. The Indian Peaks wilderness, where Patricia disappeared, has long been a magnet for hikers from Boulder and Denver. Its alpine lakes and jagged ridges draw thousands each summer. Yet, alongside its beauty is a darker history. Search and rescue logs in Boulder County show dozens of incidents every year. Twisted ankles, altitude sickness, storms that roll in without warning. Most end with rescues, but a small fraction end with recoveries or with nothing at all. Patricia's case echoes others. In 2005, a hiker vanished not far from where she would later be found. In 2010, a trail runner went missing after a sudden storm. Both were eventually recovered, but only after exhaustive searches. The pattern is consistent. The Rockies are a place where survival depends on experience, preparation, and luck, and sometimes even those are not enough. Zooming out, the larger picture grows even more unsettling. In Yellowstone National Park, more than a dozen people remain missing, their cases stretching back decades. In Glacier National Park in Montana, rugged terrain and grizzly country complicate searches, leaving families without closure. And across the entire Rocky Mountain National Park system, cases like Patricia's repeat again and again. A hiker steps off trail, a storm closes in, and days later, searchers find nothing. Sometimes, bodies are discovered years later. Bleached bones in a drainage, a boot protruding from scree, a backpack wedged under a fallen log. Other times, the wilderness never gives them back. The question now is, why the Rockies claim lives? Lives are lost because sheer cliffs, hidden drop-offs, and scree fields make a single misstep potentially fatal. Afternoon thunderstorms, snow squalls, and temperature drops can catch hikers unprepared. At 10,000 feet and above, even a fit can succumb to dizziness, confusion, or cardiac events. The sheer size of the Rockies makes search efforts incredibly difficult. Helicopters can scan ridges, but tree cover conceals even the largest clues. Patricia's case combined nearly all of these dangers. At her age, the risks of altitude and exhaustion were heightened. Once separated from her group, the odds tipped sharply against her. For families, the tragedy is not only in the disappearance, but in the silence that follows. Like Katie Moore, countless sons, daughters, and spouses are left suspended in ambiguity. They keep answering the same questions. Where could they be? Did they suffer? Are they still alive? Without remains, without answers, grief cannot fully begin. That silence can stretch for decades. Some families never receive the call Katie did in 2014. Their loved ones remain missing, their fates woven into the mystery of the mountains. Search and rescue veterans often cite Patricia Wallace's story when teaching new hikers. The lesson is simple but stark. Never separate from your group. Even experienced hikers are vulnerable alone. Know the terrain. Trails in the Rockies are deceptive, and unofficial paths can lead miles off course. Respect age and limits. Hiking at 74 was a testament to Patricia's spirit, but the wilderness does not yield to determination alone. Her case became both a personal tragedy and a public warning, a reminder that nature is indifferent to experience, preparation, or willpower. But Patricia's case also fuels a different conversation. Why are so many vanishings in the Rockies never fully explained? Skeptics point to the obvious: terrain, weather, and chance. But for others, the unanswered questions invite darker speculation. Online forums buzz with theories, some plausible, some fantastical, about hidden dangers, human foul play, or even the supernatural. What makes Patricia's story so haunting is that it doesn't provide a clean resolution. Her remains are found, but the how and why of her final hours remain unknowable. She is part of a pattern, where even discovery does not erase mystery. Ultimately, Patricia Wallace's disappearance is one thread in a larger fabric woven by the Rockies themselves. The mountains inspire awe, but they also demand respect. They have claimed thousands of lives, swallowed countless stories, and returned only fragments. For every Patricia, there are others still missing, their families waiting for the phone call that may never come. And that is the unsettling truth. The Rockies are not just mountains. They are keepers of silence, holding on to secrets that may never be revealed. Years after Patricia Wallace was finally found, her story remained alive, not just in archives and search and rescue records, but in the quiet ways her family chose to remember her. For Katie Moore, the discovery in 2014 had ended the long suspension between hope and despair, but it did not close the wound. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different kind of life, one lived with loss as a permanent companion. Katie spoke of her mother often. She told friends about Patricia's determination, about the way she refused to let age define her. At 74, Patricia still laced up her boots and headed for the ridges most people half her age hesitated to climb. Hiking was not simply a pastime for her. It was an expression of independence. That spirit, Katie believed, was what led her mother into the wilderness in the first place, and what made her disappearance so deeply painful. Every anniversary of her mother's vanishing brought with it a swell of emotions. July carried the weight of memory. The day Patricia separated from her group, the frantic calls to search and rescue, the desperate waiting. August, in turn, carried its own haunting reminder. The bone discovered by strangers in the forest, the call that confirmed what she had feared for 2 years. These months became markers not just of time but of absence. Yet Katie also found herself holding on to moments of gratitude. Gratitude that her mother had been found at all. Gratitude that chance had returned her, even in fragments, from a wilderness that often keeps its dead forever hidden. Patricia's discovery gave Katie something many families never receive, the ability to say goodbye. Over time, Patricia's name became a touchstone in conversations about wilderness safety. Her story was shared among hiking groups and in local news pieces about backcountry dangers. To Katie, this was bittersweet. On the one hand, her mother's life was reduced in the public eye to a cautionary tale. On the other, it meant Patricia's experience might prevent others from vanishing the same way. Perhaps someone would remember her story, stay with their group, or turn back before exhaustion set in. That, Katie believed, was a kind of legacy. The emotional resonance of Patricia's disappearance also lingered in smaller, quieter spaces. In family gatherings, her absence was palpable. Empty chairs at holidays, missed birthdays, the silence where her voice should have been. These were the everyday reminders that grief does not vanish with time. Katie admitted that closure had not been the end of her grief, only a reshaping of it. Knowing her mother's fate did not erase the pain. It only gave it sharper edges. Yet there were moments of comfort. Katie held on to the thought that her mother died doing something she loved. Patricia had not been confined to a hospital bed or robbed of her vitality in slow decline. She had gone into the wilderness, as she had so many times before, to walk under open skies. Though the ending was tragic, the choice to keep hiking at 74 was its own kind of testament. In the years since, Katie continued to share her mother's story whenever asked. Each retelling was both difficult and necessary. Difficult because it reopened a wound. Necessary because it kept Patricia more than just a missing person statistic. She was not a faceless entry in a database. She was a woman with courage, laughter, and love, who left behind a daughter determined never to let her be forgotten. For Katie, memory became both burden and balm. Carrying it meant reliving the pain, but it also meant honoring the life that came before the loss. That duality defined the years after discovery. Grief braided with love, sorrow bound up with gratitude. Patricia Wallace's story did not end in 2014. It continues in the lessons drawn from her disappearance, in the voices of hikers who speak her name as a reminder of caution, and in the enduring grief of a daughter who carries her memory. The wilderness kept Patricia for 2 years. But through Katie and through the telling of her story, Patricia was never truly lost. She lives on in every trail walked with care, in every warning heeded, and in every remembrance of a life that valued freedom, independence, and the beauty of the mountains. The wilderness has a way of holding on to its secrets. In the Rocky Mountains, where jagged peaks cut the sky and forests stretch in every direction, countless lives have been lived and countless more have been lost. Some vanish into its folds without a trace. Others, like Patricia Wallace, are returned in fragments, reminders that nature does not always yield its mysteries willingly. Her disappearance in 2012 and the discovery of her remains 2 years later are more than an isolated story. They speak to the fragility of human life against the scale of the wilderness. Patricia was experienced, strong, and determined. Yet even for someone like her, one misstep, one wrong turn, or one failing of the body could unravel everything. The mountains do not explain themselves. They do not tell us whether Patricia collapsed from exhaustion, lost her way in a maze of trails, or simply sat down beneath a tree and never rose again. All that remains is absence, followed by the unsettling silence of discovery. A bone found by chance. A story pieced together with questions that outweigh answers. And in that silence lies the reason her case endures. The wilderness, vast and untamed, reflects both our deepest fears and our fiercest longing for freedom. To step into it is to accept risk. To vanish in it is to become part of its myth. For Patricia's family, there is grief, but also a strange kinship with the land that claimed her. Katie Moore has often spoken of her mother's independence, of her refusal to let age dictate her boundaries. That same independence carried Patricia onto the trail where she was last seen. It was not recklessness. It was conviction, a belief that life should be lived, not sheltered. Her story reminds us that courage does not always end in triumph. Sometimes it ends in tragedy. But even in tragedy, there is meaning. Patricia's disappearance drew attention to the dangers of hiking alone, to the importance of preparation, to the sobering truth that even the most familiar paths can turn treacherous. In that way, her life continues to serve others. Years later, hikers still pass through the areas where she once walked. They carry backpacks, maps, and water bottles. They stop to tie their boots or to catch their breath beneath trees that have stood for centuries. Few will know her name. Fewer still will realize that these trails once held a woman who never came home. But for those who do know, Patricia's presence lingers in the whisper of pine branches, in the echo of footsteps fading into the distance, in the reminder that every journey into the wild is both a privilege and a risk. The mountains will always keep their mysteries. They hold the stories of those who came before, and they will claim more in the years to come. But Patricia Wallace's story will not be forgotten. Her family carries it. Her community remembers it. And now, so do we. In the end, perhaps that is what matters most, that she is not just another disappearance swallowed by the wilderness. She is a mother, a hiker, a woman who lived on her own terms. The mountains may have taken her body, but her story endures. And in the silence of the Rockies, where the wind cuts through the trees and the ridgelines fade into the horizon, her spirit remains, unanswered, unresolved, and unforgettable.